Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Murphy. We're going to go ahead and continue with Blood Passover. We're on chapter 4 of this reading. All right, let's begin. On July 6th, 1480, 3 Jews accused of ritual child murder, required for the performance of their Passover rites during the Passover period of that year, were executed at Venice. Servadio de Colonia, moneylender at Portobuffole, Mose de Treviso, and Giacobbe of Cologne, having confessed sometimes spontaneously and sometimes under torture, were impaled and burned alive in public in the Plaza San Marco, between the two columns of San Marco and San Todaro. Another defendant, Giacobbe with the beard, committed suicide in prison to avoid torture. Other Jews from Portobuffole and Treviso were condemned to various punishments of imprisonment for complicity in the crime and thereafter banned from Venice and its territory. Tried and condemned before the Podesta of Portobuffole, the Venetian Andrea Dolfin. The defendants had appealed to the Abiogara di Comum, but notwithstanding the fact that they were defended by some of the best lawyers in Padua, their sentence was upheld. According to the indictment, a small wandering beggar about 6 years of age, a native of Seriata in the Bergamo region, had been abducted from the marketplace at Treviso, where he had been begging by 2 Jews, who were alleged to have taken him to nearby Portobuffole on the Livenza River, an eventful journey, the stages of which did not pass entirely unobserved by travelers and boatmen. Here, in the dwelling of the local moneylender Servadio, who was also the instigator of the abduction, the cruel crime was said to have been committed for ritual purposes, in the presence and with the active participation of other local and foreign Jews. After draining off the blood, the perpetrators burnt the body in the oven of a house owned by Mose de Treviso, another money lender at Portobuffole. Denunciations and the informer's reports, including Donato, Serradio's servant, then converted to Christianity, are said to have led to the indictment of the Jewish defendants and to their condemnation for the murder of the nameless little victim, immediately rebaptized under the name of Sebastiano Novello, of obvious significance. Portobuffole, like so many other small centers of the Marca of Treviso and the territory of Venice, was in the 15th century the seat of a community of Ashkenazi Jews, the traces of which have remained in Hebraic manuscript texts, copied in that small city in the years preceding the Sebastiano Novello murder. The chronicle of this cruel execution, as described by the diarist apologists of the time, inform us that at least one of the defendants, Servadio, faced death in prayers, accompanied by contemptuous remarks about Christianity. This detail may be related to the legendary story of a stone slab, walled in the Ashkenazim synagogue, Schola Canton of the ghetto of Venice, containing a verse from the Psalms 32:10, quote, "Many sorrows shall be to the wicked, but he that trusteth in the Lord, mercy shall encompass him," end quote. In the local Hebraic tradition, this phrase is said to have been pronounced by Servadio himself. Among the flames of the stake in the Piazza San Marco during these terrible moments, the condemned man is said to have taken the time to point out the unhappy informer. His servant Donato baptized under the name of Sebastiano to the Jews in the crowd who were present at this terrifying ceremony. The spectators are said to have included Joseph, cantor of the synagogue of Portobuffole, who was perhaps the same phase who acted as teacher in Servadio's dwelling, who is said to have interpreted the psalm with a new meaning imparted by the person reciting it. Quote, "The bitter pains which I suffer will fall on the wicked." End quote. Thus, history and hagiography became confused, while the authenticity and memory of the child's true martyrdom ricocheted back and forth between Christians and Jews. Milan, summer of 1482, a brother of the Order of the Servetti, Giovanni Guerra, and Simon, Jew of Tortona, were publicly executed by order of the Duke. Guerra was said to have been accused of barbaciously killing a child about 9 years of age near the farmhouse of Scortevacata di Volpedo near Toronto, or Tortona, on a Holy Tuesday of that year. The second defendant was accused of instigating the friar to commit the crime so as to obtain the blood of a Christian child, as required for the Jewish Passover rites. Both defendants confessed in the preceding May. A special commission had left the court of the Sforza with the assignment of investigating the cruel death of Giovanni Costa, a young shepherd who was accustomed to coming down from the hills to Tortona to sell eggs and butter on their market days. The diligent commissioner ordered the arrest of all the members of the little Jewish community of German origin, including Mario, the local moneylender, and the requisition of all pledges deposited in the bank. The persons under investigation were subsequently transferred to Milan. At the conclusion of the investigation, the culpability of the Jew, Simon, the instigator, and the scoundrel friar, the unnatural, cruel executioner, was clearly established. The other persons under investigation, including the banker, were released, following a finding that they had nothing to do with the crime and were permitted to leave Tortano. From the official correspondence sent by the court of the Sforza to the Podesta and the Bishop of Tortona, we learned that, quote, "A certain homicide being committed during the past holy days against the person of a boy at the instance of certain Jews in the diocese of Derthona, the following persons are held in prison here: Fra Giovanni Guerra of the Order of the Servants, and one Simon, a Jew who did not deny having committed the said excess, the horrible and detestable nature of which, in the eyes of any faithful Christian, we leave to you, the judge. ... The wicked friar, with many wounds, cruelly killed the innocent boy in the region of Derthona to sell his blood to the Jews." End quote. The death of the presumed guilty parties and the prompt release of other suspected Jews were insufficient to restore equilibrium to their relations with the community of Tortona. Many Jews emigrated elsewhere, and the others became Christian. Simon's widow, executed at Milan, was left with a daughter who took the name of Michela. Simon's other 4 sons, 2 aged less than 7, and the other 2, 10 and 12 respectively, were made to take refuge with the Jews of Piacenza, out of fear that they might be converted to Christianity. On April 24th, 1483, the Duke of Milan, under pressure from the justly impatient Bishop of Tortona, Giacomo Boto, requested the Podesta of Piacenza to do everything possible to ensure that the 2 smaller sons were returned with speed to Donna Michela to receive the holy baptism. 1 second. Man, already this early. I was eating carrots. That's probably why. Where were we? Aha. In the collective memory of the Ashkenazi Jews of northern Italy, the crime of Volpedo was to appear rather similar to that of Trent. It is true that Yosef HaKohen, one of the most famous Jewish chroniclers of the 16th century, after sadly reporting the events linked to the martyrdom of Simonino, observed that in those years, the Jews in the territory of Toronto were slandered because of a Jew of the place, as had happened at Trent, and here as well the boy named Giovanni was called a saint, and the people went fornicating after him, and for us it was only harm and disgrace. The Volpedo case, involving a criminal wearing the cassock of a brother in the Holy Orders, was not an isolated one. In the summer of 1481, a Minorite Franciscan friar was arrested at Cortomaggiore on a charge of accepting a commission from the local Jews to commit a child murder, intended to provide them with the Christian blood for their Passover. The generous commission, amounting to 400 gold ducats, placed in a cage and appended with the bell tower at Cremona. The friar was left to die slowly of starvation, after which his body became a feast for birds of prey. The documents say nothing of the fate of the Jews, the presumed instigators of this holy homicide. Rinn, April 1479. In this village of the banks of the Po River, a child disappeared along the road from Padua to Piacenza during the Passover period of that year. While suspicion immediately fell on the local moneylenders Bellomo de Mario and his entourage, finally David, employed by Bellomo, decided to spill the beans and reveal the particulars of this obscure crime. His patron had commissioned Donato, a Jew from Padua, to abduct a Christian child, quote, to prepare for the Jewish ceremonies, unquote. Conveyed in secrecy to Bellomo's dwelling, the child, known only by the nickname Terlulu, was said to have been cruelly crucified in a holy ceremony with the participation of all the local Jews and others from other neighboring villages. The little victim's body is finally said to have been thrown by night into the muddy waters of the Po. This was considered sufficient to proceed with the arrest of the parties guilty of this brutal crime, as well as that of their accomplices, both men and women, including Bellomo's wife, who uselessly but vehemently protested her husband's innocence. Sacco, a money lender from the Borgo San Giovanni in the Piacenza region, who had years before been mentioned in the defendant's depositions at the Trent trial as an habitual consumer of Christian blood, and had for this reason been exposed to more than a few minor risks, was also arrested and taken to Pavia, where he was to be tried. In the meantime, Donato, the supposed author of the abduction and one of the principal perpetrators of the child's crucifixion, at the conclusion of a difficult interrogation confessed everything and pointed an accusing finger at Bellomo and his family. The Podesta of Pavia lost no time and proceeded with the seizure and confiscation of all the goods of the Jews of Rinn. But then a sensation occurred. Terlulu, the crucified child, turned up perfectly safe and sound. His body, examined by physicians and experts with all due diligence, didn't even have a scratch on it. At this point, Gian Galesso Maria Sforza and his mother, the Duchess Bona, imperiously requested that Bellomo and Donato, the principal defendants accused of a ritual infanticide that never happened, were transferred without further delay to Milan together with the resurrected boy. The protests of the Pavian authorities, who desired unperturbedly to proceed with the preparations of the trial as if nothing had happened, produced no effect. The guileless Terlulu was presented on a seat in the Senate in Milan, unaware of the reasons for all the hullabaloo, having himself become the principal personages in a sort of, quote, virtual, unquote, ritual homicide. His interrogation helped disperse the fog of mystery which still envelopes this grotesque tale. Finally, as might have been anticipated, Bellomo and Donato were acquitted of all charges in the indictment for a crime which was never committed, were released from jail and permitted to return to Arena. The Duke of Milan and his mother did not fail to voice their own profound disappointment to the rulers of Pavia in a missive sent after the release of the Jews, written without any moderation of discourse. Quote, "We are amazed, not without annoyance, by this scandalous invention of which have just caused such great inconvenience to both people and subjects." End quote. He concluded the letter celebrating his own sense of justice and equanimity, quote, "that we have caused the truth to be known about such a scandalous imputation," end quote. The Duke then demanded that the property illegally seized at Bellomo and other Jews of Arena be immediately returned. 1 month later, there was still no change in the situation, and as a result of the protests from the Jews, the Duke of Milan repeated with renewed vigor his request that the goods seized from them at that time should be returned. The response from the Podesta of Pavia is an inimitable example of both impudence and insensitivity. He would release the Jews' property and sign it back over to them, but the heavy burden of procedural costs, plus the salaries of all the judges, notaries, and functionaries having concerned themselves with the case, would have to be paid by the acquitted defendants. The ineffable Podesta said that he was fully convinced that the Jews would be open-minded and well-disposed to accede to the paradoxical statement that, quote, "for so little money, I am certain the Jews will not prove themselves too unwillingly," end quote. The facts of the Arena case led the representatives of the Jewish communities of Lombardy to appeal to Gian Galeazzo Maria Sforza so that he might defend them from the ritual murder accusations which were spreading dangerously, like a spot of oil on water, throughout all the territories at that time, threatening to conclude in the same tragic manner at the Trent affair. Nor could the confessions, often extorted with torture and violence, constitute valid proof linking the Jews to such horrendous crimes as indicated by the outcome of the affair at Arena Po. Quote, "The accused at the said locality of Arena, as a result of the tremendous torments inflicted upon them in various parts of the body, confessed to committing a crime of which they were innocent, and confined in the Castello and in the Casa del Capitino de Giustizia, for acknowledging that what they had said was actually true, and if God, in his grace, had not sent word that the boy had been found, they would have fared worse than the defendants at Trent, which only God knows whether it was true or not. And let us just hope that God makes a demonstration of the truth in due time." End quote. The Arena case was not an isolated one. The Jews, in their appeal of May 19, 1479, informed Sforza and other repeated accusations of ritual infanticide, all proving false and inconsistent, had been made over the last few months in various cities of the dukedom, from Pavia to Valenza, from Stradella to Bormio. Quote, "The following case occurred 2 months ago in Valenza. Finding that a boy was missing, suspicion being aroused against the Jews of that region, the Jews were badly threatened, and if by the grace of God the boy had not been found, drowned in a ditch, they would certainly have suffered worse. Similarly, a boy from Monte Castillo being lost, the Jews of that region were accused, but the boy was later found." Quote, "The same thing happened at Bormio as well as at Pavia. A boy remained outside the bridge of Ticino after nightfall, and was taken in by a gentleman to stay at his house, so as to return him to his own home. As the boy was not immediately found, suspicion fell upon the Jews. With much murmuring against the Jews, the house was searched with many threats, in such a way that the patron of the house fled in fear and has still not returned. And if the boy had not been found, the Jews would not have been without danger and serious trouble, as happened to the Jews of Stradella, as well as at Pavia, which were sacked, causing the people to grumble at the risk of raising a great scandal and disorder to the detriment and danger of the state of your illustrious lordship." End quote. After stating the classical motives, which should have deprived the ritual murder accusation of all credibility, particularly in light of the biblical prohibition against killing and against the consumption of blood, the representatives of the Jewish communities of Lombardy added another motive, which to our minds appears to be really odd. In the lands of the Great Turk, where powerful and wealthy Jews lived and prospered, owning large numbers of Christian slaves, both adults and children, it was said to be an easy matter for Jews to procure the blood of Christian children without running any risk to their persons and property at all. But this did not occur, and there was no news from those regions of child murders committed by Jews for ritual purposes. Quote, "There are, it is said there, innumerable rich Jews in the lands of the Turks, Moors, and other infidels, who hold slaves and servants, and are able to have Christian boys at their pleasure, to do what they liked with them without respect of or danger, which does not prevent them from doing such things in the lands of the Christians at the price of great danger, not only to their property, but also to their person." End quote. The argument could just as easily have been turned around. Even the most invertebrate anti-Semites knew in fact that the accusations of ritual murder and profanation of the host were confined to relatively small geographical areas, which included all Jewish communities of the German language regions, as well as the Ashkenazi regions in Italy, at the foot of the Alps. Giovanni Hinderbach himself, in the autographic preamble to the trials, explained the manner in which the child murder committed to the Jews of Trent was in no way a novelty. In fact, he added, quote, the impiety of the Jews had come cruelly to light over the past few years in many cities and localities of Germany, as well as in the regions such as Swabia and Bavaria, Austria and Styria, the Rhineland and Saxony, as well as in Poland and Hungary. End quote. The lands of the Great Turk were obviously excluded. Not many years had passed since the incidents at Rinn, Portobuffole, and Volpedo, when a new ritual murder case came to light, upsetting the lives of the Jewish communities in northern Italy. During Holy Week, April of 1485, in Valrovina, in the territories of the Marostica region, a 5-year-old child, Lorenzino Socio, was found murdered, his body horribly mutilated. The macabre discovery at the feet of the oak tree in a pasture on the upland plain was made by a local goatherd, while a hermit, a devout hermit who had long been a spectator and had diligently observed everything, informed the authorities and populace that the killers had committed the horrendous crime by mutilating poor Lorenzino in the foreskin. Quote, inflicting upon him by force of repeated punctures and wounds in the blood vessels, end quote. Finally stoning the body and covering it with stones. The news was immediately disseminated that the persons responsible for the ritual murder were Jews from Bassano, quote, having come to the Vesentino for business or pleasure, but perhaps principally to commit the crime, end quote. Thus, the chronicles reported the tragic fate of Lorenzo Socio da Valcravino, later beatified as Simoncino of Trent, de quo adest tradito con... I'm not going to pronounce that. That's too much. Basically, of whom tradition has it that he was killed by the Jews. Quote, in 1485, April 5th, in the Villa de Valrovina under Marostica, in the territory of the Vicentino region, the Jews stoned the sainted Lorenzino, 5 years old, and buried him several times under rocks. But one of his arms always extended from the grave. Once discovered, The delinquents were punished and all the Jews were expelled by the above-mentioned residents of the Vicentino from their city and district, and the Serenissima Prince of Venice confirmed the sentence by ducal order in 1486. End quote. 5 years later, in the spring of 1500, the Podesta of Vicenza, Alvis Moro, informed the Venetian authorities that the devoted hermit, sole eyewitness to the crime, after being incarcerated and duly tortured, had revealed the name of the person guilty of Lorenzino's murder. The murderer was alleged to be Marcusio, money lender at Bassano, which hermit is in prison here, and would like permission to speak, wishing to know the truth, that if they took one Marcuso, a Jew, they would find out something. ... Take the Jew accused of killing the boy, and take Marcuso de Bassan, and you will learn the truth, is what the hermit said, in those very words. End quote. Marcusio was the son of Lazzaro, sacerdote of Treviso, who worked at Cittadella, and was a nephew of Salamone de Piovi de Sacco. Active at Bassano, although highly unpopularly Active at Bassano, although highly unpopular locally, he had until then enjoyed the protection of Venice, constant over time, the city having renewed his 10-year money-lending permit in April 1499. We do not know whether the tardy revelations of the devout hermit induced Marcusio to leave Bassano and turn over the management of the local money-lending bank. But that was precisely what happened. After the nephew of Salamone de Piovi had become, it seems, the principal protagonist of a tardy trial brought at Vicenza for the murder of the boy Marostica. However that may be, even in that region, the mystery of the crime was not solved, nor were the guilty ever identified with certainty. In the light of what we have just observed, it seems obvious that the expulsion of the Jews from Vicenza in 1486 and the cessation of their money-lending activities were not related to the presumed martyrdom of the Saint Lorenzino. Of course, none of this will discourage historians, scholars, and local priests constantly on the lookout for more or less imaginary holy personages by means of whom their own poverty-stricken obscure village or locality may be exalted, causing it to perform an otherwise inconceivable quantum leap of fame. 23 years later at Rinn, Diocese of Bressanone, on the road to Innsbruck, a company of Jewish merchants returning from the fair at Murano were traversing a small village in the Tyrol and bumped into the 3-year-old child, Andrea Oxner. Having informed themselves as to his family, the Jews knew that the mother was far from home, in the fields at Ambras, reaping wheat, and that little Andrea had been entrusted to the care of his godfather, the Weisselbauer of Rinn, Hans Meyer. Employing every possible stratagem and pretext, the Jews induced this dishonest peasant to hand the child over to them, promising that they would take him away with them to live a life of ease and comfort, but they had no intention of traveling very far with him. Stopping in a birch tree thicket a little ways above Rinn, quote, the innocent victim's veins were barbarously and cruelly severed by those inhuman creatures, who then hung the bloodless cadaver from a tree. End quote. Having obtained the Christian blood which they needed, the Jewish merchants hurried to leave the scene, crossing the northern confines of the Tyrol on the road to Elbogen. The martyred child's body was discovered by the desperate mother. The godfather, under intense interrogation, admitted entrusting Andrea to the Jews on the promise that they would educate the child in luxury and riches. He then confessed that he had been persuaded by innumerable glasses of wine, drunk in the company of those foreigners, and a hatful of gold coins which had been placed in his hand. The impious mayor's fate was signed more by God than by men. Quote, the perfidious peasant who sold the child was condemned to perpetual imprisonment in his own house, linked with chains, where he lived imprisoned and mad for a good 2 whole years. End quote. Thus recites the implausible hagiography of Andrea of Rinn, which is full of gaps and for which there is no convincing contemporary documentation. The report remains inextricably linked to a local tradition whose relationship to reality can only leave one perplexed and dubious. Nevertheless, the Cardinal Lorenzo Ganganelli, later Pope Clement XIV, in his famous report of January 19, 1760, presented to the Congregation of the Holy Office, with which he intended in general to absolve the Jews from the accusation of ritual infanticide, made an exception in the case of Andreas of Rinn, as well as in the case of the martyrdom of Simon of Trent. I don't know if you can hear that, but there's an ice cream truck in my neighborhood. I think I'll just keep reading, but that's really distracting. The 2 cases were to be considered exceptional events, not to be generalized, but were nevertheless concrete and real. Quote, I therefore admit as true the fact of the sainted Simon, the boy of 3 years of age killed by Jews in hatred of the faith of Jesus Christ in Trent in the year 1475. Sorry, that is way too distracting. Okay, they're leaving. I accept as true another crime committed in the village of Rinn, Diocese of Bressanone, in 1462 against the sainted Andrea, a boy barbarously killed by the Jews in hatred of the faith of Jesus Christ. I do not, however, believe, even admitting as true the true facts of Bressanone and Trent, that one can justifiably deduce that this is a maxim, either theoretically or practical, of the Hebrew nation, since 2 events alone are insufficient to establish a certain and common axiom. End quote. The accused in the Trent trial in 1475, under torture and supplied ample testimony of ritual homicides committed according to them in the preceding years in the German-speaking lands from which they came, in the centers of northern Italy, where communities of Ashkenazi Jews had formed more or less recently. The defendants were alleged to have assisted or participated in these murders directly. In some cases, they had only heard about them from others. Sometimes they were able to remember the names of other Jews who had taken part. Isacco de Gribel, near Vedera, immigrated from Voitsburg, a village near Kleberg, was employed as a cook by Angelo of Verona, one of the principal defendants in the trial for the death of Simonino in 1460. Isacco attended the lower courses of a Talmudic school at Worms, in the territory of the Rhineland, and it was there that he participated in a ritual murder. A little before Passover, a Jew by the name of Hoselpocher is said to have purchased a 2-year-old child from a Christian beggar at a very high price, and to have taken that child to his dwelling in the Jewish quarter. The murder is said to have been committed here, in the spacious stufa of the house, in a collective ritual with the participation about 40 local Jews. The blood is said to have been gathered in a glass receptacle, but it is not said to have reached the quantity of liquid contained in 2 eggshells. Jove of Ansbach in Franconia was a domestic servant in the house of Maestro Tobias de Magdeburg, the occultist physician of Trent. Jove had recently immigrated from the city of Prince Bishop Hinderbach and had previously rendered service in the house of a Jew named Mohar at Wurzburg for over 15 years. During this period, Jove testified to having seen the Christian servant Elizabeth Baumgartner assigned to housework, which was forbidden to Jews on Sabbath days, introduced Christian children into the dwelling, in secrecy and during the night, on at least three occasions. The murders were said to have been committed in the woodshed in a collective ritual, which then concluded in the chapel synagogue in a ceremony with the participation of numerous local Jews. The blood was gathered in a silver chalice, while the children's bodies were buried at night in a terrain owned by Mohar outside the city. Mossy of Ansbach, the young teacher of Maestro Tobias's children, for his part informed the judges that in 1472, while he was working at Nuremberg, he had learned that a ritual murder had been committed approximately 8 years beforehand in the dwelling of certain Mayor Pilmon, in the presence of and with the participation of all the males of the family. Mosse de Bamberg was a poor traveler who, having left Bayreuth with his son on his way to Pavia, had stopped for a brief stay in the city of Trent as a guest in money-lender Samuel de Nuremberg's house, and had, to his disgrace, been present during the tragic days of the murder, confessing his knowledge of the murders to the judges. Hold on. In 1466, on the road from Frankfurt on the Oder in the Mark of Brandenburg, while transporting some goods to be sold in that city, he had stumbled across some professional child hunters. While traveling through a thick forest, Mossy had in fact encountered two Jews, remembering only their first names, Salomone and Jacobi, in the act of preparing to hurl into a nearby river the bodies of two boys, massacred by them previously. Their prey had been captured in a small peasant village at the foot of the forest. The two hunters showed the appalled Mossy their tin-plated iron bottles filled with red liquid, and were satisfied at the thought that they were going to rake in a tidy sum through the sale of that liquid. But they needed the money to live. Whether or not this was all simply a Grimm Brothers fairy tale, which might not have been at the right time and place to frighten children and give them sleepless nights, we don't know. It is certain that the poor Mossy de Bamberg could not precisely remember the identity of the two hunters and was unable to locate the forest in which the crimes had been committed, nor did he know the names of the two victims or the village from which they had been abducted or the name of the river into which they were said to have been thrown. He recited this fantastic confession before his attentive inquisitors, oscillating, suspended by a rope tied around his feet and his head downwards. Israel de Brandenburg, the strange young painter, later baptized under the name of Wolfgang, knew how to be loquacious when he had to be, and had heaps of picturesque ritual murder tales to tell. Tales which had reached his ears more or less directly, with which to regale his avid and powerful interlocutors. He had allegedly gathered this information for several months, moving from the Rhineland to the Tyrol, then down to Venice, traveling through the cities of the Veneto. He claimed to possess the first-hand information of the ritual murders of Christian children committed at Gusenhausen in 1461. And wedding 10 years afterwards, at Piove di Sacco and Feltri. Jews from his native country had told him of the ritual murders recently committed at Padua and at Vestri. The women in the trial were no less prominent, and their report of the child murders committed by their men, husbands, parents, friends, and friends were precise and detailed. Bona, Angelo de Barona's sister, was a survivor of family and marital problems. She had lived with her stepfather, Chaim. What a weird name, Chaim. From the time she was a little girl, first at Congliano del Friuli, Friuli, and then at Mestre. When she was little over 14 years old, she had been married off against her will to Mario, a Jew from Borgomanero in the Novara region. Mario had a reputation as a madman and a thoroughly bad egg who, after wasting the already scanty family fortune in gambling, had abandoned her, moving elsewhere. As a result, Bona had returned to her mother's house at Congliano del Friuli and was taken to Trent with her mother, Brunetta, also an unhappy and frustrated woman, as the more or less welcome guests of her brother, Angelo da Verona, who had in recent years been able to scrape together a small fortune in the money trade, before the judges of Bona admitted to using Christian blood during the Passover period, beginning as early as her brief matrimonial journey to Borgomanero. Her husband, Mario, had obtained it from a carpenter friend guilty of killing a boy for this purpose from Macerano in Piedmont. Quote, Bona said that during the entire time that she stayed with the said husband, Mario, her husband used the blood of a Christian child, and she did the same during the 3-year period of her stay at the Castillo de Borgomarano, adding, when asked, that her husband had obtained the blood he used from a certain Mos, a Jewish carpenter and resident of Macerano in Piedmont. That Mossi had conveyed the blood to her husband through a servant of the said Mos, whose name Bona said she did not know, and that the servant, in bringing the blood in Bona's presence, had told Mario that Mos had obtained the blood in this manner, and that one day, as Mos was on his way home from some place, he had met a Christian child whom he abducted and brought in secrecy to his dwelling, killing him and draining the blood. End quote. On the other hand, Bona, in perfect accord with Sarah, Maestra Tobias' second wife, who came from Swabia, who had lived in Marburg and the Tyrol, with Bea Mosse de Wurzburg, daughter-in-law, who had married Mosse's son Meyer and knew how to write Yiddish, and Anna Samuel de Nuremberg's young daughter-in-law, remembered another child murder committed a few years before, in 1472 or 1473, also at Trent, committed by more or less the same people guilty in the Simon of Trent affair. The victim of this murder was a 3-year-old child, sold to Maestra Tobias by a beggar in the German-speaking region and brought to Trent. The child was killed during a collective ceremony in the antechamber of the synagogue with the participation of the majority of the Jews living in the city, the blood being collected in a silver vase at night. This same Tobias took charge of throwing the body of the child into the Adej. Sarah, Maestra Tobias' wife, also remembered hearing talk in the house of another homicide committed at Trent in 1451 by Isacco and other Jews from Trent. However, she knew nothing of the details. Isacco, from Maestra Tobias' father-in-law, being the father of Tobias' first wife, Anna, who had died, leaving Tobias a widower. Isacco is almost certainly identical with the moneylender of the same name, active at Trent in the first half of the 14th century. There are, of course, no objective records of these ritual murder stories, eventful and cruel, with their horrible and repulsive connotations. The defendants were capable of inventing accusations out of whole cloth to placate their jailers, to make them more believable. These stories might have caused the names of relatives or even distant acquaintances to emerge, jumbled up from the mists of the past, from the localities of the defendants' childhood or youth, or from localities in which they had lived for a while. It is impossible to believe that the ritual murders over the same period and within the same geographical confines as those we have discussed so far are any more reliable. And that concludes chapter 4. We're going to go ahead and skip the notes as usual, because that's a lot. And we will continue on to chapter 5 at a later time. Thank you.